It's really too bad that I have to present this to you on a screen because it will be harder for you to remember it. I did my science fair project on reading retention and how it differs on paper versus on a screen. I love reading, so when COVID struck, I really missed getting books from the library. Thankfully, the library offered an app where you could read ebooks. As I was reading ebooks, I didn't like it as much as I like holding and reading a book. This made me curious how reading on paper as opposed to reading on a screen would engage my brain and my retention. This was where the idea for my project started. When I was starting to brainstorm how my project would work, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do an experiment, test my hypothesis and question. I wasn't even sure if I could do an experiment, and the COVID lockdown sure wasn't helping. However, through some research on the basic website, guidance from my teachers, and a bit of help from my parents, I was able to build an experiment that tested reading retention. In this digital age, more and more people are reading on screens and studying for things on screens. I much prefer reading a paper book, and I was curious if retention was different in reading on paper versus reading on a screen. I did background research, and it showed that the more senses and parts of your brain that are involved, the better you will remember something. Studies suggest that modern screens and e-readers fail to adequately recreate certain tactile experiences of reading on paper that many people miss, and, more importantly, prevent people from navigating long texts in an intuitive and satisfying way. In turn, such navigational difficulties may subtly inhibit reading comprehension. There is something very unique about turning the pages while you are reading on paper as opposed to simply tapping a screen. This and other background research led to my hypothesis, which is reading retention will be greater when reading from paper because more of your brain is involved. Next, I had to come up with a procedure that answered my question. For my test, I randomly split my 48 participants into 2 equal groups of 24 and named them Group A and Group B. The first week, Group A read the first Bible passage once on paper and then took a retention test on Google Forms. 3 days later, they took the test again without reading the passage. Meanwhile, Group B read the same passage once on a screen first and then took the same retention test. 3 days later, they too took the test again without reading the passage. The second week, with a new passage, the groups swapped what medium they read on and followed the same procedure as before. This graph shows the test scores for paper and screen retention. As you can see, paper retention is better than screen overall. Paper is not only better overall, it scores higher when measured by age range, by gender, and by what day you took the test on. This graph shows the test scores for paper and screen divided by age group. As you can see, in every age range, paper retention is better. When I was designing my test, I wanted to separate age ranges because age might have a big impact on retention. I thought there might be a generational difference, specifically that younger generations would score higher when reading on a screen since they have grown up with screens. Although the numbers vary a little bit in each age range, paper retention is always better no matter what age range you're looking at. I also decided to test people immediately after they took the test and test them 3 days later to see if retention on a certain medium decreased more than the other. 3 days later, retention on both screen and paper showed decline, but paper retention continued to be higher. I found this quote really interesting. Touching paper and turning pages aids the memory, making it easier to remember where you read something. Having to scroll on the computer screen makes it more difficult. The results support the research that I have done. Because more of your brain is engaged when you're reading on paper, for example, flipping the pages, retention is better. When I was designing my test, there were a few things that I needed to work through to eliminate as many variables as I possibly could to make it a success. My test design relied on many people participating, and so I had to make sure that it was something that I could do from home and they could do from home with materials that they had access to. I chose the Bible because everyone I asked had access to a physical Bible and a digital version. I made the test on Google Forms so that they could complete it online. I wanted people to answer the questions from their memory of what they just read, not their previous knowledge of the Bible passage. Therefore, I asked specific questions and chose passages that aren't too well known. I also tried to make both tests similar in difficulty. To make sure that people who have stronger memory didn't affect the results, I split my participants into 2 equal groups and had half of them read the first passage on paper and the other group read the first passage on a screen. Then they switched mediums for the second passage so that each person participated in both a screen retention test and a paper retention test. When I was making my groups, I assigned them randomly so that I didn't bias the results. In addition, I chose a variety of age ranges. By taking these measures, I worked to get as accurate results as possible. As I mentioned, I love to read, and this project was very interesting for me, and I found that I enjoyed it even more than I thought I would. One thing that I specifically enjoyed in this project was getting the results back from all the tests. It was very exciting to see what scores people got based on if they read on screen or on paper, and to see that paper retention indeed scored better. This project has been very interesting and informative, and as the project went along, it made me think of what else might be interesting to test. The research that I did showed that the more ways your brain is engaged, the more you remember. If I added listening to an audio recording of the passage while following along, would that make a difference? I also wondered what would happen if, after the participants read a passage on paper, they took the test on paper instead of on the digital Google form. I wonder if that would change the retention scores at all. I chose a Bible passage because everyone had access to a digital and physical copy, but I'm curious what would happen if they read a fiction story that they didn't know, what it would do to their retention scores. This project has been a lot of fun, and I'm excited that it shows that even younger generations remember more when they read on paper, even though they read so much more on a screen in day-to-day life. It leaves me with one big question. This past year, due to COVID, we've seen a dramatic increase in online learning. Will this be a trend that continues? And if so, is the learning for future generations being compromised? My test results suggest that we need to encourage all people to make sure that they are spending time reading a physical book and not learning entirely on screens. I'm looking forward to when I can visit the library again and crack open a book. Thanks for listening.